This finance update is brought to you by Trobe Financial, Australia's premier alternative asset manager.
Thanks for being with us here on Business Now. On a day the Reserve Bank held interest rates steady, as was broadly expected. But look, the RBA's note of caution about the global economy and the potential impact of inflation from Donald Trump's tariffs have spooked markets in recent days, largely because of the expectation of much lower interest rates is now fading just a little. Australia is largely expected to be immune from the worst of Trump tariffs, but it's inevitable our markets and rates have to be affected by what happens elsewhere around the world. Joining me from our position outside the Reserve Bank's office is the Chief Executive of Trobe Financial, Chris Andrews. And Chris, you could kind of sense the caution in the Reserve Bank statements today. Do you reckon it's justified?
Oh, absolutely, Ross, and it's good to be with you again. What we've heard from the Reserve Bank, and they always say it very deftly, but they really don't have a clue what's going to happen from here. And frankly, given everything that's going on in the world today, that's the only sensible approach.
So that being the case, you've seen in the United States all of these forecasts and measurements of recession started to rise for this year. Donald Trump hasn't dismissed it as a prospect as to what could happen. Is again this something that, you know, the people, the economy, the businesses that you lend to have to be also conscious of taking a slightly more defensive stance at this stage?
Yes, Ross, I think for investors, they need to read the signs very carefully. What's going on in the US at the moment, you know, there are a range of outcomes from here, but it's absolutely clear that Donald Trump is executing what he said he'd do in his election pitch. So if you like, the US population is getting what they voted for. For investors, now's the time to be cautious. It was only, 6 weeks ago that we're in the middle of an extended bull market. That's unequivocally not the case now. It's not the case in the US and it's not the case here. So a bit of defensiveness to investors' portfolios would certainly be warranted.
Okay, does that sort of line up with our budget that we had here last Wednesday? It seems like months ago, but it was only last Wednesday. But because the interesting thing that was lacking, both in the budget, in the Treasurer's speech, but also in the budget reply speech from Peter Dutton, was any ambition for significant growth in Australia's economy. There was no picture that I could see clearly painted to try and grow the pie here as a way of trying to minimise those expected debts.
Yes, so we are in election mode, unfortunately, here in Australia, Ross, and long history tells us it's very unusual for us to expect serious and frankly for us, essential structural reforms to be pushed through over the next 4 to 6 weeks. Both parties are absolutely in election mode, and you'll hear that in every announcement between here and May. And what we've really got to hope is that the new government, whichever stripe it is, can grab hold of that productivity agenda. We need to generate more. We need to be globally competitive. If we were entering an environment, as may well be the case, where the world is moving away from international trade, we need to make sure we are as competitive as can be over the next 5 or 10 years. It's really critical to our national prosperity.
Okay, so you take investors' money and you lend that money out to others who are trying to make a dollar on that. That's the way they repay the debts. That's the way they pay the interest that you can give out to investors. Just explain that element to me, because they need a robust economy in order to be able to take the risks, to be able to want to take on the debt, to be able to try and make a dollar in Australia.
Borrowers, investors, employees, employers, everyone in the economy depends on this, Ross. In the end, you've got to grow the pie. If you're not growing the pie, in the end, as our population grows, we'll all be taking smaller shares. And frankly, that's what has already been happening in Australia over the last 2 years. We've had per capita recession over the last 2 years in Australia. The point is, you've got to grow that pie so that over time, all of us, including our children, can grow their wealth and look forward to a life of prosperity. That applies to borrowers, that applies to investors, that applies to everyone in our economy.
So what's interesting to note this also, Chris, is that if you consider also that retail sales were only up by 0.2%, in February, again, the consumer, even though they've had tax cuts, even though it might have been a little bit better than expected, the fact of the matter is they're really not back spending in the way in which they were sort of going back 2 or 3 years ago.
The consumer is feeling the pinch, Ross. I think there's very little doubt about that. Sentiment for the consumers has been really poor for a very extended period, for many, many years now. And what gets that back? The sense as a nation that we're actually growing our wealth. And when we think about productivity at the same level as it was in 2016, and I know we're a bit of a broken record on this point, but that just tells you how parlous things are. So whilst we can expect that our political parties won't be driving a productivity agenda over the next 5-6 weeks leading into the election, it's on us, market participants, businesses and individuals in Australia, to be demanding this of our government. When we're demanding it, Ross, they'll listen.
Yes, indeed. I tell you what, it's always good to have you. I'm pleased you're outside the Reserve Bank today, Chris. Chief Executive of Trobe Financial, Chris Andrews, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Ross.